With great power comes great responsibility.
Compromise where you can. Where you can't, don't. Even if everyone is telling you that something wrong is something right, even if the whole world is telling you to move, it is your duty to plant yourself like a tree, look them in the eye and say, no, you move.
Never step onto the battlefield of ideas unprepared. Before you enter the fray, you need a plan. And there's no better place to get one than right here on Tactics with host Caleb Colquitt. The Situation Room goes live now on News Radio 1440.
Welcome in, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us, whether you're joining us on Facebook Live on the Tactics page or the News Radio 1440 page, Twitch, Periscope, YouTube, however you're watching us. We're certainly glad that you have decided to make us a part of your day. So I apologize for not being able to do a show the other day. I'm making some major adjustments. There's going to be some hiccups to the show, unfortunately, because of this. Frankly, just to give you a little glimpse behind the curtain, I'm actually starting a second job to kind of bolster my income and also to help me be able to pay for a master's degree, which I plan on starting before too long. So that's part of the reason that I'm going through all of this, but I'm going to do the absolute best that I can to continue to bring you the local news, everything that's going on within the state of Alabama, here in the River region, and of course, national news as well. So thank you so much for being with us. Thank you for supporting the show. Be sure to like and subscribe this video, and that way you'll always be able to get our latest notifications whenever something like that happens. Well, that is, of course, if you click the little notification bell, because apparently subscriptions don't mean very much to YouTube anymore. But nonetheless, that's what's going on, and there is quite a bit of local news to get to on this Tuesday afternoon. So Governor Ivey has been the source of quite a bit of news, which is kind of weird when you think about where Governor Ivey came from. Now Governor Ivey is, of course, the duly elected and installed governor of the great state of Alabama, but you have to remember that she was originally the lieutenant governor, which is, I wouldn't say a completely inert position. There are certain times where the lieutenant governor is very important, and I would never do anything to disparage Will Ainsworth, who I think has done a fantastic job with the lieutenant governorship, but let's be honest, it's a largely ceremonial role in a lot of circumstances. It's one of those things that isn't very useful in most cases, at least in this state, and then becomes incredibly important in a handful of rare circumstances. That being, of course, when the Senate is tied and the lieutenant governor is the one that breaks the vote. He breaks the tie by voting himself. Or in the circumstance that we had, where the governor, for whatever reason, is unable to fulfill his duties, has to resign, or, God forbid, passes away, something like that. And that's the situation that Governor Ivey found herself in, that Governor Bentley resigned, and she wound up being the governor of the state of Alabama, then wound up getting elected, and now she is at the middle of a national firestorm because she was the governor, of course, that signed into law the controversial abortion ban bill. But before we get into that, and before we talk about that, because I do think it's important, I think that there's something else that is more important than, not more important than the abortion ban bill itself, but certainly more important than the media firestorm surrounding it, sort of the pundits and celebrities firing, that Governor Ivey did something else today that is garnering quite a bit of attention, and should, and it's for a good reason that just about everybody would agree with, and that is that Governor Ivey today ordered all flags to be at half staff for Auburn's police, the Auburn Police Department's William Buckner. Now, for those of you that are unaware with the story, Officer Buckner was killed just a few days ago over the weekend when he and two of his comrades, fellow police officers, went to investigate a domestic dispute. And based on what we know now, and the subject is the suspect is in custody right now, he was fired upon by this guy who was involved in the alleged domestic dispute, and his other two officers were wounded when he opened fire, but unfortunately for Officer Buckner, he lost his life. Lost it in the line of duty. And because of that, the governor has issued a statement that all state organizations and offices will fly their flags at half-staff in honor of our fallen police officer. He becomes the third police officer within the state of Alabama to lose their life in the line of duty in the year 2019. And Governor Ivey issued this statement in response to this and sort of giving an explanation for why the flags were at half-staff. She said, Buckner laid down his life protecting the people of Auburn, and the entire state of Alabama mourns his tremendous loss. Simple but effective. Absolutely correct, Governor Ivey. And the vast majority of people, regardless of their political affiliation, regardless of where they are religiously or, not even just politically, but culturally, the vast majority of us really, really appreciate our police officers. It's very rare to find somebody that does not appreciate the tireless work that they do, including working through holidays, including putting their lives on the line. It's a very dangerous job, and their lives are often put on the line specifically to protect the lives of others. And unfortunately, when you're in a job like that, not everybody comes home. It's a shame that that's a concern. It's a shame that that's something that their families have to deal with every night, wondering if their loved one who is a police officer is going to walk through that door safely. It's a very difficult thing to have to deal with, and I've never actually had to deal with that. I've had members of my family that served in the military, but honestly, not recently, not in the recent history, and also not in a way that I was, waiting for them and waiting up nights and that kind of thing, hoping that they would come home. With a police officer, I imagine that even though it would be much harder to be separated from your family for a long period of time when you're talking about military service, and a lot of police officers are former military, but when it comes to the police officers, that's something that every day they have to worry, are they going to walk through that door home tonight? And sometimes they don't. And unfortunately, that was the case when we're talking about Officer William Buckner. Luckily, the two guys he was with did. Now, they had to go to the hospital because they sustained injuries, but thank God he was the only one that lost his life there when these police officers were fired upon. And based on the latest news, it looks like the two officers that were answering the call with him that got shot and got injured, that they are actually going to be okay, and they're supposed to be discharged from the hospital not too long from now. But what I would ask the audience to do, and the reason that I continue to ask this, and the reason that I emphasize this, is because despite what people in the media, despite what celebrities, despite what news pundits might tell you, your prayers matter. They do make a difference. I am living proof of that. I am alive today. I am convinced, and no one can convince me otherwise, that I am alive today because of the fervent prayers of many people who tried to make sure that I was going to be okay, and it obviously was successful. It worked. Went back for a checkup just yesterday, and so far as we can tell, my numbers are good. My tumor markers are still down. There's no sign that it's coming back. So I am living, breathing proof of the power of prayer. And that's the reason that I come to you today asking you, because of course it was a great thing to honor this fallen police officer with the flags at half-staff. But far more important than that is to pray for this man's family. Remember that it wasn't just a loss of a police officer. I mean, for us, it's a terrible loss in the sense that we hate to lose one of our civil servants. But for that family, he left behind a wife and a son and a stepdaughter who unfortunately are never going to see the person that they love walk through that door again. It's going to be a time of incredible suffering and asking a lot of questions, and so I do ask sincerely that you fervently pray for this man's family, that they would find strength and understanding through the Lord in this very, very dark time. And we all will continue to pray for this officer's family, and also for the officers that thankfully were not killed but were injured. Now, they're expected to make a full recovery. We don't expect them to have any complications or problems. They're supposed to be released from the hospital, thankfully. But, it's going to take some time for them to recover as well. And who knows if they'll be able to continue on with their duties as police officers. Not sure about that. Not sure how that works. Not exactly an expert on the procedures of police officers, but hopefully that they'll be okay as well. So just continue to pray for all those that were involved, because your prayers do make a difference in the lives of other people, even if they're people that you have never met. Now, that being said, Governor Ivey is at the center of a firestorm that she's come under fire. Granted, one thing that is interesting, and we mentioned this last week, is that not many people on the left are actually going after Governor Ivey directly, because the narrative that they would prefer to push is that it's a bunch of old white Republican men that were the only ones that were in favor of this abortion ban. And because of that, they don't really want to focus on the governor signing it. And you'll notice that there is a distinction there. Because when you're looking at, for example, Georgia's abortion ban, they have focused keenly on Governor Kemp. They have mentioned Governor Kemp by name over and over again and talked about how cruel he is and how he's going to be responsible for the economic downfall of his state because of the whole thing with Hollywood protesting and all these other things. They don't mind bringing up Brian Kemp. The reason that they do mind bringing up Governor Ivey, and the reason most are not talking about Governor Ivey specifically, is because even though they dislike the Alabama bill more, they would rather focus on the senators that voted in favor of the abortion ban rather than the House or rather than Governor Ivey, because when you add that in, you're talking about a female governor and several female members of the House, one of which, the sponsor of the bill, was female as well. And so because of that, they're trying to avoid talking about that and just zeroing in on the Senate, because every vote in the Senate happened to be from a male. And because of that, it's a way for them to push this narrative that only men are against abortion and only women are for abortion, which is absurd on a number of levels. And like I've said, even if you're looking at the statistics, both state and nationally, and even if you expand it to worldwide, Pew Research found that there's very, very little difference between the number of men and the number of women that support abortion, that if you're looking at a gender gap, there really just isn't one when it comes to abortion. But nonetheless, that is what has been going on. And so because of that, they've kind of avoided talking about Governor Ivey. But now there are some on the left that are starting to pick it up and start to actually go after Governor Ivey specifically. And one of these individuals is Jim Carrey. Jim Carrey, who has made some good movies in the past. I mean, he's really good in The Grinch. A lot of people really like Ace Ventura. I thought it was okay. But anyway, Jim Carrey, he makes an awful lot of movies. Some of them good, some of them not so great. But nonetheless, regardless of whether you think he's funny or not, he is a raging leftist and has been for a number of years, which is hilarious also considering some of the themes of his own films, but nonetheless, we'll go along with that. So Jim Carrey the other day on Twitter posted this, and just a fair warning before I show the graphic, it is kind of disturbing. It's a cartoon, it's a picture, so it's not, an actual footage of an abortion, but it is a little bit shocking. But here's the tweet from Jim Carrey, where Carrey says, "I think if you're going to terminate a pregnancy, it should be done sometime before the fetus becomes governor of Alabama." And as you can see, that is a graphic of sucking the brains out of baby Governor Ivey, a painting that is specifically tailored to look like Governor Ivey, sucking the brains out of baby Governor Ivey before, I guess, being elected to the Alabama governorship. Well, the truth is, I am glad that Jim Carrey tweeted this out, specifically targeting our governor, and there's a couple of reasons why I am glad that Jim Carrey did this. And first of all, especially including that graphic, even though it's disturbing, it is honest about the nature of abortion. And so, yes, I find it disturbing, and yes, I gave a disclaimer warning other people that it's disturbing. But the fact that it's disturbing is probably the best thing about it, because it's depicting an abortion, which is disturbing. And if an abortion is disturbing, that is reason to at least consider making it illegal. Because this is what I've been saying from the very beginning. If you're talking about something that is either it's either a tragedy or it's not, I'll put it that way. Either abortion is something to be shunned and to be steered away from, and it should be something that is talked about somberly and with some remorse, or the Cecile Richards of the world that are saying, well, we ought to shout our abortion and talk about how great it is. Honestly, even though that's grotesque and wicked, and I appreciate the character of those that understand that there is something that is wrong here, that has gone amiss, that I think that their conscience is bothering them about it, and that leads them to know that abortion is not something to be proud of. It is not something that should be thought of as being a favorable outcome. It should be kind of a last resort sort of thing. Even though I appreciate them more, the truth is they're less consistent. The more consistent stance to take on abortion is either it is a life and it is something that should be protected, and abortion is something that should be gotten rid of, or, well, this thing isn't a human at all, and so it's like clipping off a fingernail. That's all it is. At least they're more consistent. And the truth is, there are a growing number of top Democrats, not talking about Democrat voters, talking about Democrats as a whole, that are starting to take this stance of, you know what, it should just be legal right up to the point of birth, and we might even consider killing it after that. Granted, even though that makes no sense, it's horrible, it's immoral, it's still a more consistent, not a completely consistent, but a more consistent stance to take than the people that are saying, well, I don't think that people should be killing a baby after 25 weeks. Now, is that better? Yes, it's better because I want there to be less abortions. But as far as looking at it from a sense of logical consistency, if you're saying, well, we don't really know where life begins, but I don't think there should be abortions after 25 weeks, that's a completely inconsistent stance to take. Either it's a human or it's not a human. And if you're saying it becomes a human at X threshold, then you've got to have some kind of clear defining line. And like I've said, the only clear defining line that makes sense and is completely consistent is conception. That is the only way to scientifically define a human that does not conflict with other humans that would be outside the womb. It's the only way to adequately decipher what humanity is. But the reason that I appreciate this tweet is because it is very honest about the nature of abortion. It is taking a person that is fully grown, and Governor Ivey was just as much a human when she was conceived as she is today as an elderly woman. And so depicting somebody aborting an elderly woman is no different than watching somebody abort a child inside the womb. So again, this is very honest about the nature of abortion. And the fact that they're sticking a tube in there to suck out the brains, that's again something that actually does happen in a real abortion. And so what we're dealing with here, even though what Carrie was tweeting was horrific and grotesque, it is horrific and grotesque just like a real abortion. And that should cause people to think, maybe this is not a policy that I ought to be considering legal, or that I ought to consider as something that should be okay or permitted. So that's the reason that I actually really appreciate this, because it is at least honest about the nature of abortion, and it's also honest about the stance of several Democrats. Again, this is not a position held by the average Democrat. In fact, only 13% of the American population believes in abortion up until the point of marriage. In other words, if you're looking at and you actually dig down into the numbers and where the average person stands, even though, again, I think it's inconsistent, there are only 13% of Americans that say, yep, any time between actual birth and conception, we ought to be able to abort it at any point during that time. Only 13% of Americans actually agree with that. But a large plurality of that 13% are now leaders in the Democrat Party. If you do not believe me, look at the Senate. Just a few months ago, the Senate considered a 25-week ban on abortion. So in other words, everything after 25 weeks, that would be illegal nationwide. The Democrats in the Senate voted against it, making us one of only 7 countries at the federal level to allow this to take place, to allow there to be an abortion taking place after 25 weeks. We're right there with China and North Korea. Not exactly great company to be in. And yet, this is how things have shaken out. The Democrats, really, that is their stance, which is far to the left of the average American, which is, again, the reason that I think that this tweet, though despicable, was very honest. And the stance that it is taking is not only abortion up to the point of actual birth, but it's also honest about the stance of, really, we wish that we could kill our political opponents. Now, again, I think that this is a minority opinion in the Democrat Party, but we have heard this stuff before over and over again. I can't tell you how many times we saw this in Alabama just a couple weeks ago, where John Rogers, the representative from Birmingham, was saying, well, Donald Trump Jr. said something that I disagreed with, so he ought to have been aborted. There is nothing in this world less tolerant than my political opponents ought to be dead. That's about as extreme intolerance as a person can get. Saying, nope, anybody that disagrees with me, they should no longer be alive. And granted, I still to this day think that this is a minority opinion in the Democrat Party, but it's one that Jim Carrey espouses and one that other people are not shunning. By the way, it's also important to note, since we're on the subject, that Brian Sims kind of did this same routine. That Brian Sims, who was out harassing old women and teenage girls, big tough guy, really, harassing teenage girls and old women, that were protesting in front of a Planned Parenthood, and by protesting I mean standing there and talking to people, not yelling, not screaming. I don't even remember any of them holding signs. Just sitting there and praying and talking to women as they were coming in. That's all that was happening. And he goes out harassing them, calling them names, trying to scare them off, trying to intimidating them, threatening to go over to their house, all this other crazy stuff. This guy actually holds public office in the state of Pennsylvania. And this is what he was doing. Well, earlier today, or it may have been yesterday, but I'm pretty sure it was today, he actually issued a fundraising letter to Planned Parenthood. A fundraising letter, mind you. And in this, he apologized for him making the movement look bad. Saying that he reflected poorly, essentially, on Planned Parenthood and on the pro-abortion people. So he doesn't apologize to the girls who he threatened to dox and have mobs of people show up at their house. He doesn't apologize to the old lady that he harassed and tried to get people to show up at her house. He apologized to Planned Parenthood merely for reflecting badly upon them. That was apparently the only thing he could bring himself to admit that he had done poorly, and vowed to do better in the future. Not because he thought attacking them was wrong. And this gets down to the core problem. The reason the pro-abortion crowd believes that abortion is okay is because they have dehumanized the unborn. And what's really sad to see, and what is frankly kind of terrifying, is that there are at least some people on the left, like Kerry, like Representative Rogers, like Brian Sims, that have dehumanized their political opponents. Because essentially the reason that Brian Sims has not apologized to these people is because in his mind, he did nothing wrong. That because they've offended him, because they disagree with him, that any action he can take against them is justified. In Jim Carrey's case, that putting up this kind of imagery, this kind of art that is essentially saying, anybody that disagrees with me on this, they ought to die. They ought to be dead. That's perfectly acceptable. And the same thing for Representative Rogers saying the thing about the president's son. That any of that is fine. And yet they'll often accuse the right of being the ones that are inciting violence. Well, saying that this person ought to be dead because they disagree with me, that's a pretty strong incitement of violence. Now, I don't think they should be held accountable if somebody, God forbid, tried to assassinate Governor Ivey tomorrow. As horrible as that would be, still not Jim Carrey's fault. But the point is, if you're going to be critical and you're going to hold this standard of, well, you have to be more civil or else you might be giving license to people to be uncivil and to take it a step further into violence, if that's the standard you're going to hold, you got to hold yourself to that standard as well. It's also important to note that in all of these cases, whether you're talking about Brian Sims, Representative Rogers, or in this case, which specifically the medium that it went out on first was Twitter, none of the social media sites have said that we're going to censor them. None of the social media sites that have specifically said that inciting violence is the standard that they often use to try to justify taking down any kind of conservative or even not even necessarily conservative, but somewhat right-leaning, somewhat complimentary to Republican videos or content. These same people are looking at Jim Carrey literally saying that Kay Ivey should have been aborted and drawing a picture of that process taking place, saying, no, that's fine. Really shouldn't even worry about it. It's good. And this is part of the reason that there is a very obvious, blatant double standard. And I also would like you to remember that I actually praised Jim Carrey the last time he went on Bill Maher. And part of the reason that I did praise him is because even though he said a whole lot of stuff that I disagreed with, and I pointed that out too, that one of the things that he started out with is he said, we have to get past this point where because people disagree with me that I have to hate you. And talked about I'd be willing to sit down and talk to people that have disagreements with me to have a meal with them or whatever and hash it out. I was like, well, that's very refreshing. I actually really appreciate that. And then he goes and does stuff like this, which proves that he's full of crap. That you're saying, well, we need to be more civil and we don't need to hate each other just because we have a disagreement. Saying that you want somebody dead because they disagree with you, I'd say that constitutes hate. I mean, not that I'm the world's leading authority on that, but I'm pretty sure that would constitute hatred. Just putting that out there. And furthermore, when it comes to this, when it comes to Jim Carrey putting this kind of stuff out there, despite saying that we really need to make ourselves more civil, we need to be more cautious about the way that we address one another and talk to one another, this is part of the reason that people on the right and conservatives in general, it's part of the reason that when people on the left call for civility, they tend to not believe them. Because, and Jim Carrey is just one example of a lot of people that have done this. Maxine Waters is a perfect example. Nancy Pelosi is a perfect example. What they'll do is they'll call for civility. They'll call, let's tone it down. Let's not be so uncivil. Let's not, personally attack our opponents. And then they'll turn right around and do exactly that. And that's the reason that people on the right are very skeptical of people on the left saying, hey, let's call for civility, because the second that it's their turn and they have the opportunity to be either civil or uncivil, they pretty much always go with uncivil. And it's a darn shame, but that's the way that it is. And that's the reason that trust, that benefit of the doubt usually isn't there. Now, personally, I try to extend the benefit of the doubt when I can. I try to extend it just because I think that it's the right thing to do. But it's hard for me too, because there's always that thing in the back of your mind thinking about things like Jim Carrey saying, hey, let's just all be decent people to one another. And then, not too long afterward, pictures of political figures that you don't like having their brains sucked out by a tube and saying that they ought to be dead. That's the reason that it's pretty hard for people on the right to really believe that people on the left are sincere when they call for more civility. That's about as good an example as I could give. And by the way, I would like to also point out that all of this is happening during a time, and this is also news that broke today, that Alabama has surpassed its goal of all time of adopting foster children. Now, you may say, what does that have anything to do with it? And that's because you're a rational thinking person. We will get to that in a second. So Alabama today has broken its all-time record for foster children adopted. So children that entered the foster care system were placed with foster parents. Those children being adopted is what the statistic that we're dealing with here. As of fiscal year 2018, in a report that came out today, 710 foster children were adopted. So great for them that they have found families that they can now have a permanent home with. And we really, really do applaud that Alabama has broken its record on that. Now, according to the bureau that oversees this, there are about 6,375 children in foster care in the state of Alabama right now, and approximately 70% of them return to their biological families, their blood families. So if 70% of that are actually going back to their own families, and you look at the numbers of the total children that we've got, that gives you about 11% were adopted in 2018. So 11% of the children overall in the foster care children system, those children are being adopted by their foster parents. Another 70% eventually wind up going back to their biological families. That means a whopping 81% of foster children either go back to their original family or get adopted. Now, we can definitely do better. There is room to grow. And hopefully something great happens for that 19% and we do even better next year and the next year. But the point is, the vast majority of kids in the foster care system have at least a somewhat happy ending. Now, there may be kids that wind up going back to their biological parents that wind up back in the foster care system because of something that happens. And of course, that's truly unfortunate, but that does happen from time to time. But the point is, and the reason that I'm pointing this out, is you've got 81% of kids in the foster care system no longer in that system by the end of the year. And so it really is astonishing the amount of kids that are finding good homes, and that's because our system does work. Doesn't work perfectly, not everything's ideal, but it does the best that it can with really bad situations, and I'm really glad that the numbers are up in this, because the reason that I'm tying this in together with the whole thing about Alabama's abortion ban is that there is this myth that is going around, and there's really no truth to it whatsoever. It's just a very emotionally charged talking point, that conservatives do not care about kids once they're outside of the womb. I mean, we hear this all the time, that you can't be against abortion if you're not for all these giant government programs. The government programs aside for a second, because of course there can be people that oppose those because they really don't care about children, but the vast majority of people that don't support them, like myself, just happen to be fiscal conservatives that say that there are better ways to handle it. You're not against the child being taken care of, you're against the child being taken care of specifically by the government. And so in this case, we've got groups of people that are willing to invite children into their home, and after some time make that child a legal, legitimate part of their family, just like their own children. Now, this has nothing to do with abortion, because abortion specifically deals with babies that are born and are put up for adoption as soon as they are born. So the foster care system has nothing to do with abortion, but they often try to make these claims about all the kids that are in the care of the state, and those numbers are just going to rise if you make abortion illegal, which there's not an ounce of truth to. In fact, there is such a high demand for babies to adopt that there are a lot of Americans, thousands upon thousands of Americans, that have to adopt from other countries because the waiting list is so long in the United States of America. There are couples perfectly financially sound, good people, that wait literally for years, and this is a process I'm a little familiar with because it's happened in my family multiple times, and also with people I go to church with. I mean, one of my best friends, for example, is adopted. So when you're talking about this foster care system, has nothing to do with adoption whatsoever, nothing to do with adoption, nothing to do with abortion whatsoever. Nothing to do with that, because that's a completely different statistic. That's one that is being dealt with kids that are adopted as soon as they're born. But even if that weren't the case, even if it did have something to do with abortion, the numbers are still up. In this ruby red state that now has the strictest abortion ban in the country on the books, we're seeing a drastic increase in the number of adoptions. So this idea that, well, if you're for abortion being illegal, then you also have to be for all these massive government programs, this is a bargaining tactic. What they're trying to do is they're trying to say you need to either support abortion or you need to support all of our big government spending programs. Neither one of those are true. It's a completely unconnected political issue. But nonetheless, even if they were connected, these statistics prove that that's not true. There are many Christian families in conservative states that take in children in mass and do the best that they can to take care of them. And you're really sitting here and telling me that they're the ones that don't care about children, the ones that actually take them into their home and make them their own children. Those are the ones that don't care about kids, but the ones that vote for you to take money from rich people to give it to children, those are the ones that really care about the kids. No, I don't buy that, not even for a second. And it's also important to note that the vast majority of adoption agencies are faith-based anyway. That a lot of the adoption agencies and the people that work to make sure kids get a good home were started by people that specifically believed that they were doing God's work, that they were doing the Christian thing by engaging in that practice. So no, this idea that Christians only care about children when they're in the womb, there's absolutely no truth to that. Any angle that you look at it, even if you give them every advantage and connect things that aren't even connected to the issue, it still falls apart. Let's go ahead and go to the phones. Good afternoon. What's your name?
Hey, good afternoon.
Yeah, go ahead. What's on your mind?
Yeah, just wanted to talk about the foster care for just a minute. You know that I've had a direct experience with that.
Right, you're a foster parent, correct?
Right. And the 4 children that I'm closely familiar with, they're in foster care because the state took over custody of the parents because the parents were in trouble with the law, most of the time with drugs.
Mm-hmm. That does happen a lot, unfortunately.
It happens a lot, and there was also some sexual abuse and things like that. Didn't have anything to do with abortion at all. They're just big numbers with that, and it's hard to get those kids adopted because most of the time, or say a lot of the time, they're up in school, teenagers that are in a situation, and that's far from the womb, which is what they try to equate it to, which is a ridiculous argument. It has nothing to do with that. And they always they put out those big numbers and say, well, these Christian conservatives care nothing about the children. And then their next argument is to go to the border and say they have zero concern about children being locked up and put in cages on the border.
Well,
and so they tie it back to that.
And it's kind of a self-defeating argument because they're essentially saying we don't have the resources to care for every single child in America, but then basically in the same breath saying, but we ought to be bringing in all kinds of children from other countries and then we need to take care of them as well. Well, if the system can't take care of what we already have, what makes you think that we can take care of a whole bunch of children from other countries as well?
And actually, we do a pretty good job of taking care of our children.
We do.
There are a lot of people that are willing to take them, like you said earlier, into their homes. I've often wondered this, just as a scenario, and I certainly would not be in favor of this, but let's say if we had a policy that forced every illegal immigrant that comes across the border, if they're expecting to have an abortion, I wonder what the pro-choice people would say about that.
Well, there was actually not exactly that scenario, but there was a case recently where they were trying to make the point that not only should people coming across the border have a right to an abortion, but that the federal government ought to be paying for that abortion.
Of course they say that. Yeah, but you have big numbers with foster care, so it makes it look like that Christian conservatives, Republican people have no concern at all for children. And the reason that they are against abortion is because they do have concern for children. And the difficulty that I have with it is that most of the people that are spouting out the most really don't care about children, don't have children, and don't intend to have any children. Like the radio talk show host I'm talking about that is a lesbian person, and she wouldn't dare have any children. She doesn't like them at all. But she's the first one that will say, you know, you need to protect the choice of women, and all you're trying to do is white supremacists that are trying to keep down the women and keep their choices away from them. I've heard her have that kind of rhetoric over and over again. So that's what you're dealing with there. Nonsensical people that really don't have any concern about anybody.
Well, and that's really what it all goes back to is, for the vast majority of these folks, the only thing that really matters is making political hay. And
Sure.
so the fact that the foster care system and the abortion argument are completely separated, there's really no connection between the two of them whatsoever. They still try to make the connection and try to make the case that Christians don't really care about kids, even though they're the overwhelming majority of
Sure.
people that do the adoptions and are engaged in putting together organizations to help kids find the homes. Whether or not there is a factual basis for their argument matters very little to them, because they're not arguing from a place of logic or logical appeal anyway. They're trying to get emotions whipped up, and they're very good at it.
Well, we all know that there will be the women that are contemplating having an abortion. They would always have someone to take their child if they would take it to term. There would never be an abortion done, because there would always be someone. As soon as they were put on a list and said that, you know, I'm trying to decide whether or not I want to keep this baby, they would be lined up as long as would need to be with the number of parents that would want to take the children. I have no doubt in my mind about that.
Well,
there would always be a home for them, always.
And that's one of the reasons that whenever you get into a discussion about abortion with somebody and they say, are you really telling me that you're saying that a woman ought to be legally obligated to take care of this child and raise it and whatever? And I always say, no, I didn't say that at all. She has the option for putting it up to be adopted. And there are tons of homes that, and I said, when you're talking about a interruption into her life, there is going to be, if abortion were outlawed and she would have to carry it to term and give birth and all of that. But the idea that her entire life would be raising that child from then on, that's simply not true, because adoption does exist and they act as though it doesn't.
See, I think that's where our churches would really go to bat for programs like that.
Sure.
Where they didn't want to have the child and they didn't want to keep it for the rest of their life, in other words, and raise that child. There would always be parents that would be willing to take them.
Well, that's a big part of the reason that Christians have been pushing for the crisis pregnancy centers and been opening these facilities up across the country, so that women know that these things are options, and that if you don't want to raise the child, there is somebody that does love your child that will take care of it for you.
That's why Agape exists.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great organization. I've done work with them. Well, thanks so much for your call. I appreciate it. John from Millbrook. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to take a break, and Mayor Pete Buttigeig actually speaks out on this in his Fox Town Hall, and we're going to give you sort of my reaction and some of the fallout of that. That's all coming up when we come back.
And now for a reading from the Social Justice Warrior Bible with Pastor Gregory Post.
Welcome in. I'm Gregory Post, head pastor at the Eternal Living Word Trans-Denominational Community Church and Coffee House in Novato, California. And now for a reading from the SJW Bible. Today's reading will be from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 7, verses 2 through 10. And a centurion slave was sick and about to die. When he had heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders asking him to come save the life of his slave. When they came to Jesus, they earnestly implored him, saying, "He is worthy for you to grant this to him, for he loves our nation, and it was he who built our synagogue." Now Jesus was triggered upon hearing this and said, "None of the good things he has done matter, because he is a slave owner, and we must never admit that anyone that ever owned slaves is capable of doing anything good. Furthermore, Instead of asking me for help, you should have passed universal health care by now so that he could receive treatment for free." Then Jesus started on his way with them, and when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends, saying, "Lord, do not trouble yourself further, for I am not worthy for you to come under my roof. For this reason I did not even consider myself worthy to come to you, but just say the word, and my servant will be healed. For I am also a man placed under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to this one, go, and he goes, and to another, come, and he comes, and to my slave, do this, and he does it." Now when Jesus heard this, he marveled at him, and turned and said to the crowd that was following him, "I say to you, this man is engaged in systematic oppression. He is clearly engaging in wage slavery by controlling the means of production to exploit the labor of those around him." Then Jesus gathered up a mob and protested on the centurion's lawn all night long, with torches and signs reading, "Down with the patriarchy," terrifying him and his family. We never really found out what happened to the centurion's slave. Wow. So inspiring. Thank you for listening to this reading of the SJW Bible, and remember, the only truth that matters is your truth.
And welcome back. As promised, we are going to talk about Pete Buttigieg and his Fox town hall. Now, before I get into the actual clip, and we are going to show a couple of clips of him speaking, but before we do that, just wanted to make this clear. This guy, I think, is a very, very good politician. And part of the reason that I am saying that is because he has a talent for putting a happy face and a moderate persona, maybe sort of an air of reasonability on things that are very, very radical, very far to the left. And this was a talent that Barack Obama had. You may recall all throughout the Obama years and covering him, I never once said that he wasn't a good politician. I never once said that he was not a good speaker. He was very, very talented at taking something that was radically to the left and making it sound like a mainstream opinion that would be rational for any normal person to have. And Buttigieg has a pretty good talent for this, and specifically we're going to talk about his stance on abortion to kind of show that off. So remember what I said earlier. Only 13% of the United States population actually believes in abortion up until the point of birth. Only 13%. So, I mean, by definition, you are pretty far to the left. You are pretty far out of the mainstream of most Americans by holding the stance. And yet, Pete Buttigieg, I think, does a politically fantastic job. What he's saying, of course, is horrific. But he does an amazing job of painting that as though it is a reasonable position to take, and we'll watch that in his Fox Town Hall here in a second.
Forces them to make an impossible, unthinkable choice. And the bottom line is, as horrible as that choice is, that woman, that family may seek spiritual guidance, they may seek medical guidance, but that decision's not going to be made any better, medically or morally, because the government is dictating how that decision should be made.
Okay, I'm not sure what's going on here.
What policies would you put in place to protect every woman, regardless of her zip code's right to have an abortion?
Thank you. So I believe that the right of a woman to make her own decisions about her reproductive health and about her body is a national right. I believe it's an American freedom, and I believe that should be enjoyed by women in every state.
And I guess the question is, do you believe at any point in pregnancy, whether it's at 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 24 weeks or whenever, that there should be any limit on a woman's right to have an abortion?
You know, I think the dialogue has got so caught up on where you draw the line that we've gotten away from the fundamental question of who gets to draw the line. And I trust women to draw the line when it's their own life.
So just to be clear, you're saying that you would be okay with a woman well into the third trimester deciding to abort her pregnancy.
Look, these hypotheticals are usually set up in order to provoke a strong emotional...
In fairness, sir, it's not hypothetical. There's 6,000 women a year who get abortions in the third trimester.
That's right, representing less than 1% of cases.
I know, but 6,000 pregnancies.
Let's take ourselves in... Yeah. So let's put ourselves in the shoes of a woman in that situation. If it's that late in your pregnancy, that means almost by definition, you've been expecting to carry it to term. We're talking about women who have perhaps chosen a name, women who have purchased a crib, families that then get the most devastating medical news of their lifetime, something about the health or the life of the mother that forces them to make an impossible, unthinkable choice. And the bottom line is, as horrible as that choice is, that woman, that family may seek spiritual guidance, they may seek medical guidance, but that decision's not going to be made any better, medically or morally, because the government is dictating how that decision should be made.
All right, so Pete Buttigieg discussing his stance on that issue. And like I said, guy's a very, very talented spin doctor. He is a very, very talented politician because he can make something that is uber radical sound like it's reasonable and something that, well, just about everybody would agree with. And part of the way that he does that is he gives a specific hypothetical and expands it to the whole, because you'll notice he would not directly answer the question of whether or not he thinks that women in the third trimester ought to be able to, but he kind of does in saying that, well, nothing should be restricted. Essentially, that's what he said in his first one, is that we should leave that choice up to the woman. And so that was sort of his fancy way of saying, and that's again the reason that he's so good at taking this uber radical idea and making it sound rational for everybody. So first of all, one of the things that I have to take issue with is the way that he answered the initial question by the spokesperson there, saying, well, it's a national right and it's an American freedom. Well, Buttigieg, the founders would have vehemently disagreed with you, because if you look at their writings, a lot of people will make the case that this is not an issue that our founders dealt with. But if you're looking at British common law and you understand, especially looking at one of our founders, Joseph Story, who was one of the original Supreme Court justices, looking at the way that he thought about it, the way that he wrote it, he said specifically that, because again, we act like abortion's this new thing that just happened. It's been going on basically as long as human history has existed. Joseph Story, who wrote the original American law book and was there in the original Supreme Court, he said in his law book that you protect life from beginning to end, and that any woman or any man that gives a woman a potion to terminate the baby living inside of her, this is murder. So this is something that the founders would have agreed with, that they would have consented to. There was no opposition to this. This was so common a thing that everybody just assumed it to be the way that things ought to be. In the same way that we would suggest that killing somebody with an axe is murder, they would say that killing an unborn baby with some kind of potion or remedy, that would be murder. And so in every circumstance that we're talking about here, it was something that was so commonplace that the founders all agreed and consented to. That is not something that is a right at all. It's certainly not American. It developed much later than the founding era, this idea that ought not be something that is prosecuted, and there's a reason that you have double homicide laws in the terms or in the case of a woman that is pregnant, dying, or being killed, or whatever else it is. There's a reason that our legal system has always treated that as a life, because it is a part that is ingrained into American common law. It is enshrined there, going all the way back to British common law, which Joseph Story points out. So the idea that it's an American right is absolutely absurd, but I will say this for him. He actually does get to the root of a problem that I think is actually a good question to ask. Now, what he was pointing out is, he says, we get so caught up on where the line is that we forget about who is drawing that line. I actually agree with that very broad general statement by Buttigieg. I don't think that he's wrong there. Because we do often focus on these arbitrary lines that there is no clear scientific definition for example, viability. For a long time, the line was viability. Whenever the child is viable outside the womb, then that's when you're no longer allowed to do an abortion. But the thing is, viability is a moving target. It depends on where you are. It depends on the quality of Medicare around you, or medical care around you. And it also depends on the technology and the age that you're living in. A child that is viable now at, very soon in pregnancy, we're talking about 4 and 5 months, wouldn't have had a chance of surviving in the 1970s. And yet you can't say that just because medical technology got better, that person was human or is human now, but wasn't human then. And so Buttigieg is right that drawing all these arbitrary false lines doesn't help anybody. And I think that it is actually a better question to ask who draws the line. And so the question ought to be, can you humanize another person? Can a human being, is there any other circumstance where a human being gets to decide for another person where that line is? Seriously, can you think of one that gets to say, you know what, they're not human anymore, their life doesn't really matter, we should go ahead and kill them? Because I don't think that there is another scenario where you can do that, where you can just, as another person, say, that person's life is inconveniencing me, so I really need to go ahead and get rid of them without said person's consent. And so this is really the question that he asked that I actually think makes a lot of sense. And no other person ought to be able to draw that line. And the problem here, and he kind of highlights it there, this is a fancy way of drawing the Democrat standard, which is basically, well, it's a baby if you want it to be a baby. Because you'll notice that even people on the left, when they have a baby shower, they call it a baby shower. Because regardless of the age of the child growing within the mother, regardless of the age of the fetus, which, by the way, they act like that's a magical term that makes it okay to abort it. The word fetus means offspring. It actually means child. So when you call it a fetus, you're still calling it a child. But nonetheless, when you're talking about that, they still refer to it as a baby shower. When liberals talk to each other, when they're expecting, they talk about it as though it's a person. They use gender-specific pronouns, which, granted, is getting rare now on the left. But the point is, they refer to it as him or her. They'll say, when is the baby due? And so this weird standard that the left has come up with is essentially, you get to decide whether your baby is a human or not. And it's completely up to you. It's completely the woman's choice. If she wants it to be a human, then it's a human from the time it's conceived to the time it dies, maybe 70, 80 years later. If you don't want it to be a human, then it's not a human up until it makes the journey 8 inches down the birth canal. And in some cases, not even then. And so this arbitrary line has been created, and Buttigieg is trying to reinforce that by saying, you know what, I trust women to make that decision. Yeah, I don't. And I'm not saying that because I don't trust women specifically. I don't trust any human being, regardless of their gender, to be able to just arbitrarily decide when someone is a human and when somebody is not a human. By the way, we had that for a long time in this country. It was called slavery, where certain people decided, you know what, that person's not human. I can make him do whatever I want to. In fact, I can kill him if I want to, and it's fine because he's not a human. The idea that your humanity is contingent upon the whims of another person is insanity. And the fact that Buttigieg can basically restate that, and granted, he does a pretty good job of restating it as though it sounds rational, but it really isn't. The fact that he can say that and get applause from a audience there, the fact that he can say that and people on the left are like, yeah, that's pretty solid. That's about what I would be at. Even most Democrats used to draw a line somewhere, like saying at least we can't do it in the third trimester. In fact, you'll remember that in one of their presidential debates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton got into it over abortion, And Donald Trump said, well, she supports partial birth abortion or abortion right up until the point of birth. And Hillary Clinton was actually offended. Now, I don't think she was really offended, but she at least acted offended at the accusation that she was for abortion all the way up until the point of birth. That was something that she understood was politically unpalatable and refused to acknowledge that that was her stance. Now, everybody in the Democrat field is saying that. So the left is not only far to the left, the Democrat thought leaders are not only far to the left of the average American, they're to the left of where they were just 2 years ago, 3 years ago. They are to the left of where their party was then. And it really is telling that they continue to do this. Now, here's another thing that you need to consider. If your humanity could be basically decided by somebody else, would liberals ever accept the argument that men ought to be able to just decide when women are humans? We'll just decide when they're human. If it's your sister or your spouse or your wife or whatever, or your sister or whatever. If that's the case, and men can just decide that, again, when you apply that same logic to another scenario, it shows how absurd it is. Because it's faulty logic to begin with, and so applying it to something else just kind of uncovers that mask, uncovers that pretty packaging, that wrapping paper that they've tried to wrap this crap sandwich in to make it sound like it's a better idea. And dehumanizing certain parts of the population is how tyranny always starts. Doesn't matter what kind of population, doesn't matter if it's based on race or nationality or whatever else. There's always a group of people that before people take power, they try to dehumanize. In this case, it happens to be the unborn. Now, another thing to point out about this is that even though I've pointed out all the flaws in logic here, even his scenario isn't factually accurate. And Chris Wallace does try to push back on this a little, but then kind of lets it go. There are 6,000 late-term abortions, which is going to be less than 1% of abortions that are performed. But here's the thing. So Buttigieg is technically true on that, but his logic in, oh, well, that means that we can just dismiss the late-term abortions doesn't make any sense. And to point out how absurd this is, here's why. In 2018, only 17 school children died of school shootings. 17. There are 56.6 million school children in the United States. And only 17 died of school shootings, which would mean that 0.00000, that's 4 zeros between the decimal place and this, 0.00003% of school children were killed in school shootings. Does that mean school shootings just aren't a big deal? That we should just, not worry about it? I've never heard a Democrat make that case. And by the way, they shouldn't. School shootings are a big deal. We should take them seriously. But this idea that, oh, well, it's less than 1%, it's just 6,000, we don't have to worry about that. No, you do. That's still important. That's still significant. That's still 6,000 babies that would be alive today that aren't now. And so this idea that it's just not a concern because it's statistically small, that doesn't make any sense. If you're concerned about the lives, you have to be concerned about the lives. You can't just disregard it because it's a smaller portion of the lives being talked about here. And by the way, another thing that would be important to note here is this flowery image that he tried to paint, which is tragic and emotionally jarring, of a woman that has this horrible news that, again, I don't know what medical scenario this would actually end in, but that her baby is going to cause all kinds of health problems and she has to decide between dying herself or the baby dying, and this is somebody who's already got a room ready and bought a crib and all this other stuff, and the baby already has a name, and then she decides to get an abortion, that this is what normally happens with a late-term abortion. It's simply not true. According to a study done by the Guttmacher Institute, which, by the way, is a very, very pro-choice organization. They are openly admit to being an abortion advocacy group. So this is not coming from The Blaze. This is not coming from Breitbart or Fox News. This is coming from an organization specifically that advocates for abortion being legal. In a study that they did, their numbers showed that the vast majority of women that were seeking late-term abortions did not do so for health reasons. That the vast majority of them were doing so for personal reasons, whether that was personal finance, personal convenience, whatever it may be. The point is, well over 80% of the women they surveyed were not looking for it because of health reasons. And so this idea that were the case, that it's some kind of horrible news, that's what we're talking about here, it's completely disingenuous for him to use that line of attack. And here's another thing that we also have to consider. Even if that were the scenario, even if that scenario were the norm, every abortion ban has an exception for life of the mother. All of them, including the one in this state. Alabama has the most restrictive abortion ban in the country. Most restrictive one, and there is still in that an exception for the life or health of the mother. And so he's trying to drum up this idea that these bad, evil, nasty Republicans are looking at a woman who really wants this baby and would love nothing more than to be able to take her healthy child home, and she gets the bad news that she's going to die if she doesn't do it, that Republicans are trying to keep that woman from being able to live and having an abortion. That's not true. Whether you think that's morally correct or not, it's simply not true legally. That woman still has the ability to seek out an abortion late in her term if there is a life or health of the mother exception, even in the state of Alabama with the strictest abortion laws in the country now. So it's a completely disingenuous argument. He knows those exceptions are there. He's not a dumb person. But he's trying to drum up this imagery of this evil, heartless Republican that's saying, no, I don't care that you're going to die. You're going to have that baby anyway. That simply doesn't exist. It just does not exist. Now, he also, in this same thing, called for other radical ideas like socialized medicine and higher taxes, which, by the way, the socialized medicine is especially funny since his own staffers that work for his campaign don't get health care from his. So he's saying health care is a right and a human right and everybody should have it. Well, do you give your employees health care? Not really. So there is that. But my point is, this guy is so good at taking insane, radical ideas and dressing them up nicely to where they sound reasonable that he may be the most dangerous person in the Democrat field. Now, I don't think he can win the primary personally, but if he does, I think that it's going to be really hard for Donald Trump to beat him because he reminds me a lot of Barack Obama. And Barack Obama, as radical and socialist as he was really good at pretending like he wasn't. Now, right now, the left is really angry, and they want somebody that is openly socialist and somebody that doesn't really dress it up nicely because they think that that person is not sufficiently liberal. And a lot of people think that about Pete Buttigieg on the left. So maybe it's a moot point. Maybe he winds up not necessarily getting the nomination anyway because of that. But I got to tell you, if he actually does wind up winning the nomination, that is going to be an uphill battle for the president. I think it's going to be Joe Biden. I think the numbers kind of support my hypothesis on that. But, man, if Donald Trump has to face this guy, it's going to be trouble because he's going to come off as mean and nasty, and Pete Buttigieg isn't. Now, you could make the argument people like a fighter. People would rather see someone more like Donald Trump, and there are some people that would. But I'm just telling you right now, strictly from a political standpoint, there's a reason this guy has risen in the polls so quickly. Because he is really good at taking super far left radical socialism and making it seem like something that everybody should get behind. The guy is a heck of a salesman. And he's about as good as anybody I've seen on this, including Barack Obama. So that being said, let's go ahead and go to the Daily Dose of Stupid.
No, you messed it up.
You're stupid.
Today's Daily Dose of Stupid comes from Bernie Sanders, so we'll go ahead and show you this. Bernie Sanders tweeted this out earlier today. Apparently he was doing some kind of event and wanted to announce it on Twitter, so here we go. Walmart workers are sick and tired of being paid poverty wages. While the Walton family is worth over $170 billion, I'm honored to have been invited by Walmart workers to demand they have a seat at the company's board. All right, so there's a number of really stupid things that Bernie is assuming here. First of all, Walmart is the nation's largest employer, more than anybody else, whether you're talking about people that actually work there as cashiers or stockers or managers, whatever else. You've also got the amazing amount of infrastructure they have. They have people that work in personal shoppers for their new pickup options. They have people, a lot of truckers have to drive all of that equipment, all of that product from, town to town, from city to city, from state to state. There's a ton of infrastructure. There's a ton of maintenance that goes into all of that. There are all kinds of people that are employed by making products that are sold in Walmart that don't even actually directly work for Walmart. And so there is no doubt whatsoever that Walmart is, on the whole, very good for the American economy. And that there are a lot of people that have gotten rich, and the average person, even if you just shop there, has gotten wealthier by Walmart, having cheaper products, having more products that you want. Even though I'm not really a personal fan of some of Walmart's business practices, some of their models, I've been critical of Walmart before. The point is that there is a lot of good for the economy that Walmart does, regardless of how you feel about them personally. But this goes even a step further, that Bernie is now saying that they're paying poverty wages. They're not. In fact, if you're looking at Walmart's starting pay for their lowest employee, so we're talking about somebody on the bottom rung of the ladder, somebody that is pushing carts around, all of those people, their starting wage is $11 an hour. Now, it's not quite the 15% that Bernie Sanders wants, but the point is $11 an hour is nothing to sneeze at. And to prove my point on this, that means not a minimum wage, not a medium wage manager, not somebody that's working their way to the top, or because there are those people too. The average salary at Walmart, I think, is actually north of 15. I think it's 18, something like that. But we're talking about somebody just starting out, somebody on the absolute lowest rung of the ladder, on the floor of the Walmart corporate structure. That person starts at 11, which comes to, if they work about 40 hours a week, that comes to roughly $22,880 a year. So, yeah, that person's not getting rich. That person is not living in the lap of luxury. But they are making, at the absolute base level, $22,880 a year. The average pay for a worker worldwide, if you're looking at every country, is a little under $18,000, which means that the Walmart employee is making about $5,000 more than that person, $4,000 to $5,000 more, depending on, because the average wage fluctuates a little bit. And so if you're looking at the average pay of the average worker all across the world, people in Walmart are making $5,000 a year more than that person. All right, so let's adjust it. Let's see if this is really a poverty wage. So the world poverty level says that you live on $1.90 or less per day. That's how the global standard is, that's the poverty level. If you're living on less than $1.90 a day, you are living in poverty. Which, by the way, if you multiply it by 365, comes to $693.53 a year. So in other words, if you're looking at the yearly salary, what actually constitutes poverty is 3% of a Walmart worker, the lowest paid Walmart worker's salary. 3%. So you're making 33 times the poverty level. So this idea that Walmart is paying poverty wages, I'm sorry, Bernie Sanders, you're not even close to correct. There is no universe you could come up with. You would have to change math for you to be correct, or completely change the poverty level. So there's absolutely no objective rubric whatsoever that Bernie Sanders is even in the same ballpark with being correct on this. And somehow, even though a Walmart worker is making 33 times the poverty level, even though he's making about $5,000 more than the average worker, not the average poverty worker, the average worker in the world. So Walmart employees are making more than the average employee worldwide. Somehow this is very bad because the Walton family has $170 billion. Somehow this is very bad because the Waltons are very rich. It doesn't matter if you're still doing better than everybody else, if you're still making significantly above what the rest of the world is making. Why are you so concerned with what the Walton family has? And there's very few of them. There's an awful lot of Walmart employees. That's the reason that they make a lot and the average Walmart employee doesn't. Because there's a lot less of them and they invested a whole lot more than the average Walmart worker. But somehow this is very bad because the Waltons happen to be very wealthy people. This is what it all boils down to. Socialism is built on envy. It always has been. And this is just more proof of that. Socialism is the gospel of envy because it goes around converting people by convincing them that they are worse off than they actually are by saying there are other people that are better off. The 1%. Saying that there are other people over there that are doing better than you, ergo, you're not doing so well. Ergo, you shouldn't be thankful for what you have. You should be rioting in the streets and trying to take that money from them. You see, the fact that there is any disparity whatsoever, regardless of what the job is, regardless of what the personal investment for anyone is, the fact that there is any difference in pay in a company at all is, in the mind of a socialist, some kind of great injustice that is being done here. They don't account the number of years worked. They don't account the number of hours worked. They don't account the level of investment, like I said, with the family history. All they're looking at is raw numbers and this person has less than this person, ergo some kind of injustice is taking place. That's the epitome of envy. Looking at something that somebody else has and says they should have less. Instead of trying to bring yourself up and improve yourself to their level, you're saying, no, I'd rather drag them down. That's what envy is. It's wanting somebody else not to have something just because you don't have it. It's wanting somebody else to have something taken away from them just so they can enjoy it, even if you don't get it. That's really what is at the core of envy, and that is why socialism is evil from the very onset. You see, socialism can only survive. It can only bring more converts into it by showing other people, well, there are other people making more than you, ergo you should be dissatisfied with your life. The only way socialism spreads is by an angry mob, angry that other people have things that they don't. We'll go to the chaplain's report.
In 1775, the Continental Congress created the Chaplain Corps. Under the command of General George Washington, each soldier was required to attend worship service every Sunday. While other armies advanced on their feet, Washington's troops advanced on their knees. It's time for the Chaplain's Report with Caleb Colquitt on tactics.
Chaplain's Report today does continue our series in the book of Daniel. Now, we've kind of moved out of the narrative part of Daniel and really moved into the prophecy, the latter half of the book of Daniel. So we're going to go ahead and look into a verse where, just to give you a little bit of context, David is having some kind of sort of dream vision where he is seeing all these fantastic things and trying to interpret them and understand exactly what's going on. And in this dream, he sees 4 great beasts, a winged lion, a bear, a winged leopard, and what he refers to as a dreadful beast with sharp fangs of iron. Now, on this, I don't know why he doesn't give a whole lot of description to the latter one, or at least give some kind of description of what it's like. Maybe it was just so unusual that dreadful beast was all he could come up with, and then gave a few descriptors. But nonetheless, this is the vision that David sees, and he sees all these cataclysmic things. And then the Ancient of Days, which is referring to God. The Ancient of Days shows up and is seated at the throne, and all of these things take place. Now, it's important to remember that whenever you're reading apocalyptic literature, that it's not intended literally. That what is going to happen is not that literally in the future that we're going to see these great beasts and fantastic things happening, that it's symbolic of a real world event that is going to happen in the future of Daniel's, not necessarily in the future of Daniel's life, but in the future after Daniel has lived. And some of it actually does take place within Daniel's life. We've seen that some of the prophecies that he's already interpreted have had some root, and we've seen some of those events take place, specifically when he interprets the dream about the tree. But whenever we're looking at prophecy, even though I do think that some people make a mistake in putting too much investment in understanding exactly every detail of what each one means, and will sometimes even argue and cause disputes within themselves and amongst their fellow brothers and sisters about the actual intended meaning of the prophecy, there is something that ties all of this together, and it's actually found within the book of Daniel itself right here in Daniel 7:13 through 14. I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came to the Ancient of Days, and was presented before him. And to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed. So there's a couple of things that we really need to note here. First of all, for anybody that is familiar with the language of the New Testament, it doesn't take a very big leap to understand that what he's talking about is the coming of the Christ. Because if you're looking at the words and the verbiage that he's using specifically, they're talking about his dominion being everlasting, that its kingdom will never pass away, it will never be destroyed. All of those things fit in, especially if you're reading the book of Matthew, where it talks about the kingdom and the kingdom of Christ coming. If you're looking at that, it is not very difficult to understand that the prophecy is specifically referring to Christ, and it's important to remember that this is well over 400 years before Christ lived. That Daniel is predicting all of these things, that all of this language is coming about, and that all of this is being pinned down before anybody even knew who Jesus was or what he was going to be like. And yet Daniel is able to do this and is able to explain all of this long before the coming of the Christ, which is amazing when you think about the level of detail and everything that comes in. But it's also important to note that I think it ties everything together with a continuous theme. Now, I think that it's important for us to look at the prophecy, to look at the apocalyptic literature and understand it, because God would not have given it to us if he didn't want us to study it and to draw meaning from it. God doesn't just arbitrarily hand us a bunch of stuff. Hey, this was just stuff that was floating around in my head. Try to decipher it if you can. No, God gave us this stuff specifically because he believed that there were important messages contained within it. God gave us this stuff for our spiritual enrichment and to be able to grow closer to him. So I'm not saying the meaning of Scripture or the meaning of prophecy is not important. I think it's of the utmost importance. But I also believe that we need to remember, when trying to understand that, is one thing that is always clear throughout all of apocalyptic literature is the theme that eventually God wins. That regardless of the comings and goings, regardless of the political upheaval that happens, within this kingdom or that kingdom, which we'll get into a little bit later, these different beasts represent, that at the end of the day, when all is said and done and you bring it all together, the most important message is God's kingdom prevails. That despite everything going on this physical earth, the spiritual kingdom of God, the one that was established by his Son, the Son of Man, as it is referred to right there in the book of Daniel, and a phrase that Jesus refers to himself as over and over again, that the Son of Man, his kingdom, is one that is never destroyed and transcends all nations and all time. And that is a really humbling notion. To think that we serve a king whose dominion is everlasting and can never be destroyed. It really does remind you of what a powerful God that we have. It reminds us that no matter what happens on this earth, no matter all the circumstances or the dangers that may befall us, the persecution that we can endure, that we can take solace in knowing that whether we win a political fight or lose a political fight, or a nation turns completely away from God, which I am afraid that our nation may do at some point, that even if that does happen, we are still a part of a kingdom that is not going to be destroyed, because its builder and maker is the Son of God himself. And as long as he is a part of that kingdom, as long as he is the king over those people, we're going to be just fine. Because we belong first and foremost, more so even to our country, to a great kingdom that was not built with hands and will last forever because its foundation is spiritual. Stay the course, friends.
Tactics is a production of News Radio 1440 and Cumulus Media Montgomery. Any opinions expressed on this program are those of the host and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of Cumulus Media. The theme song for Tactics is 6 Foot Town by Big and Rich. Graphics by Jessica Dawson. Broadcast studios provided by Cumulus Media Montgomery. Location studios provided by the Dalraida Church of Christ. Copyright 2019.